There is a particular kind of evening in Atlanta in late July when the heat refuses to let go even after the sun goes down. It hangs in the air like something unfinished. It settles on your skin. It makes you feel the city's weight in a way that is almost intimate, like the city knows you are there and simply doesn't care whether you stay or go. On those nights, the streets of Midtown fill up in a certain way. Not crowded, exactly, but alive. People stepping out from restaurants with that loose, unhurried satisfaction of a good meal and a cold drink. Couples on the sidewalk. Dogs on leashes pulling toward fire hydrants and lampposts and each other. The hum of traffic on 10th Street. The neon reflections bending across rain-wet asphalt even when it hasn't rained. It was that kind of night. The kind of night Atlanta makes look beautiful without trying. And somewhere in that warmth, a woman was lacing up her shoes. Her name was Katie. Katherine Janness. 40 years old, though the people who knew her best would tell you she carried that age the way some people carry a favorite coat, lightly, comfortably, without performing anything at all. She had grown up far from here, in the Detroit area, in Michigan, where the summers have a different quality entirely, sharp and precious, surrounded by too many months of cold. But she had made Atlanta her home. Had built something here that took years and patience and the kind of quiet stubbornness that doesn't look like strength until you see it from a distance. She had arrived around 2006. Just her and whatever she had decided to bring. Over the years, she had layered a life onto the city the way you furnish a new apartment, slowly, thoughtfully, one room at a time. She had taken a job as a bar manager at the Whole World Improv Theater in Midtown, a place full of laughter and performance and the kind of people who talk with their hands and stay too late and mean it. She had been there for nearly a decade. Long enough to become part of the furniture. Long enough for the regulars to know her name before they asked for a drink. A coworker named Chip Powell would later say of her, she was the most down-to-earth, beautiful spirit you would ever meet. He said it like someone reaching for something larger than words and settling, reluctantly, for those. She had also worked as a bartender at Campagnolo Restaurant and Bar, a neighborhood place just up the street from where she lived with her partner. A place that smelled like garlic and wine and honest conversation. She kept odd hours the way bartenders do, late nights, quiet mornings, the world slightly inverted from everyone else's. She had learned to love the rhythm of it. She collected books. Shelves of them. The kind of collection that says something about a person, not what they want you to think of them, but what they actually think about when no one is watching. She had taught herself to play guitar. Had written songs, sitting somewhere in that apartment, working out chords by feel until the melody arrived. Her friends remembered her as an artist. Not in the performative sense. In the private, driven, quietly passionate sense that never quite asks for attention but always deserves it. Before we start, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. She had 2 dogs. There was Tori, her own, a 14-year-old pit bull, sweet and slow in the way of old dogs who have survived the years through loyalty and patience. And there was Bowie. Emma's dog. 3 years old. A pit bull too, young and eager and named, presumably, after something someone loved. Bowie had that particular puppy energy that older dogs tolerate with an air of dignified suffering. He went everywhere Katie went. He was, in the language her future father-in-law would use, her constant companion. Emma Clark was 30 years old. She was, by every account, the center of Katie's world, and Katie was the center of hers. They had been together for 7 years. 7 years of building something together in a city that rewards that kind of commitment with neighborhood familiarity, with favorite restaurants and regular tables and the security of knowing where everything is and what it costs and how it feels to come home. Emma's father, Joe Clark, would describe them the way parents describe children who have found their person, the way people describe a thing so obviously right it almost makes you ache. They would have been together forever, he said. They were that couple. The kind of people whose love was not a performance or a project but simply what they were. Their relationship was built, he said, on a mutual understanding to let each other live a full life. Which sounds, in retrospect, like something said about people who understood that life is short, even when they didn't yet know how short. They lived about a mile from Piedmont Park. That detail seems ordinary. Unremarkable. A fact about geography that would not, under any other circumstances, mean anything at all. But in the story of what happened to Katherine Janness, a mile feels like the distance between the world and the end of it. Piedmont Park is enormous by city standards, 185 acres in the middle of Midtown Atlanta, green and generous and full of the unofficial social contract that city parks carry. Dog walkers and joggers and families with strollers and couples who want somewhere to sit outside that isn't a restaurant patio. It has a dog park and a pond and long winding paths that feel, in the daylight, like a kind of exhale from the city's noise. There is something about a park in the middle of a city that makes people feel safe in a way that isn't always rational. Green means calm. Open means visible. Known means harmless. People had been walking Piedmont Park for more than 100 years. It had been a fairground and a battlefield and a public commons. It had been the backdrop for movies, the setting for concerts, the meeting place for vigils and protests and ordinary Tuesdays. It had hosted Olympic soccer. It had seen everything Atlanta had become. On the night of July 27 into the early hours of July 28, 2021, the park's internal cameras were not working. They were old. The equipment had not been updated. The cameras were still mounted, still present, their casings visible on their poles. They looked like cameras. But they recorded nothing. That detail, a row of dead eyes pointed at the dark, would come to haunt an entire city. But no one knew that yet. Emma was working that evening at Henry's Midtown Tavern, a bar on 10th Street, the same street that runs along the northern edge of Piedmont Park. She was on her shift, moving behind the bar with the efficiency of someone who knows their space, who knows where everything lives and how to reach for it without looking. At approximately 11:35 in the evening, Katie stopped in. She had Bowie with her. She came through the door the way people do when they are between things, not staying, not making an event of it. Just passing through. Just saying hi. Bowie would have been pulling at the leash, curious about the smells and the noise, and Katie would have said something, smiled at Emma the way you smile at someone when the sight of them still, after 7 years, lands softly inside your chest. She did not stay long. She had the dog. She had a walk to finish. She left. That was the last time Emma saw her alive. There are moments like that one, ordinary, small, the kind that happen dozens of times in any relationship without meaning anything at all, that become unbearable in retrospect. Not because anything was wrong with them. But because they are ordinary. Because there was no ceremony and no goodbye and no awareness that anything was ending. Just the door swinging closed and the night air outside and the footsteps going away. Emma stayed at work. Katie walked Bowie into the Atlanta night. The city was warm and loud and full of light. The crosswalk at 10th Street and Piedmont Avenue had been painted in the rainbow colors of pride, a piece of civic art that had become a landmark, a photograph that tourists took and locals walked across without looking down because you stop seeing the beautiful things once they become yours. Sometime around 1 in the morning, a security camera at a nearby business captured Katie and Bowie at that crosswalk. She was walking away from home. That detail would later be noted by investigators, and it is the kind of detail that resists easy explanation. Not because it is suspicious, necessarily. But because it is simply unknown. Perhaps she was extending the walk. Perhaps Bowie had pulled her in that direction and she had followed. Perhaps she had a destination, a route, some private navigation that made perfect sense to her and exists now only as a question with no one left to answer it. The camera captured her in mid-stride. Bowie beside her. The rainbow crosswalk beneath her feet. It was the last image of Katherine Janness that has ever been made public. After her shift ended, Emma biked home. She walked into the apartment, and it was quiet in that particular way that is different from ordinary quiet, not peaceful, not relaxed, but still. The kind of still that has weight in it. Katie wasn't there. Neither was Bowie. Emma wasn't immediately alarmed. Katie walked late. She knew Midtown. She knew the streets, Emma would later say. She knew everywhere she was going, all the time. There was nothing unusual, in principle, about a woman who knew a neighborhood being out in it at night. But the phone didn't pick up. And then it didn't pick up again. And there is a moment, different for every person, impossible to locate exactly until it has already passed, when the absence of an answer begins to feel like an answer itself. Emma opened the Find My iPhone app. The location that came back was static. Unmoving. A pin dropped in the dark near the entrance to Piedmont Park at 10th Street and Charles Allen Drive. She got on her bike. She rode toward the park. The night was still warm. There is something particular about riding toward a thing you don't yet believe. Emma Clark was moving through Midtown Atlanta in the early hours of July 28, 2021, and she was doing what people do when they are not yet afraid. She was solving a problem. Her partner's phone was in the park. There was a simple explanation for this. There were many simple explanations for this. Maybe Katie had sat down somewhere and fallen asleep. Maybe she had met someone she knew. Maybe Bowie had gotten into something and the cleanup had taken longer than expected. Maybe. The mind is extraordinarily generous with maybes when the alternative is too large to look at directly. She approached the entrance at 10th Street and Charles Allen Drive. Later, Emma would describe what she saw in pieces, the way trauma forces us to receive things, not as a whole, but in fragments, in glimpses, the mind protecting itself by rationing the unbearable. At first, she saw what looked like a trash bag. That is not a description she offered lightly. It is the description of someone whose mind was working very hard, in real time, to find an alternative to what her eyes were giving it. A shape in the dark near the gate of the park. A collapsed form. And her vision wasn't perfect at a distance. So she told herself it was a bag. Something discarded. Something that had nothing to do with her. She went closer. It was Bowie. The dog was lying on the ground near the entrance. Stabbed. His body already still in that final way that leaves no room for hope. Emma would later say that even in that moment, seeing the dog, knowing what that meant, feeling the world shift into something unrecognizable, she did not find Katie right away. It was dark. The park lights that existed were not enough. And her eyes moved across the scene the way eyes move when they are trying not to find what they are looking for. But then she did. Katie was lying near a tree, not far inside the entrance. Perhaps 100 feet from the gate. And Emma, who had ridden her bike through the Atlanta night on a theory, who had told herself there were maybes and explanations and simple things that explained everything, Emma went to her. She went close enough to see. She went close enough to check. And then she ran. She ran back out of the park and she called 911 and her voice, in that call, held everything that had happened in the last few minutes and everything that would happen for the rest of her life, and the way she spoke was the way people speak when the thing they most feared has arrived so quickly and so completely that the voice hasn't caught up with the reality yet. Police responded at approximately 1:10 in the morning on July 28, 2021. What they found at the entrance to Piedmont Park was described by detectives, in a word, as gruesome. That is a word used carefully by people who have seen the full range of what human beings do to each other. A word that carries weight by virtue of who is saying it and what they have already seen. The detectives who walked into that scene had context. They had comparison. They used that word anyway. Katherine Janness had been stabbed more than 50 times. The medical examiner's report, when it was released months later, detailed it in clinical language, the kind of language designed to hold catastrophe at a distance, to make it navigable through precision. Sharp force injuries to the face, neck, and torso. Blunt force trauma to her head and extremities. At least 15 stab wounds from her forehead to her chin alone. Defensive wounds on her hands and fingers, the injuries that come from reaching toward something that is cutting you, from trying to stop something that cannot be stopped. She had fought back. That detail, sitting inside the clinical language of a medical report, is one of those things that refuses to stay clinical no matter how many times you read it. She had wounds on her hands. She had tried. In those final moments, in the dark, near the gate of a park she had walked 100 times, with the city she loved arranged around her in its ordinary nighttime beauty, she had tried. The letters F, A, and T had been carved into her chest. That is a fact that stands alone and resists interpretation. Investigators noted it. Journalists reported it. The community absorbed it and recoiled from it and turned it over and over in the way that people turn over things that feel like messages without being able to read the language. Was it personal? Was it random? Was it the expression of a rage that had been building toward someone, toward her specifically, or toward anyone who happened to be there? Nobody knows. Bowie had been found approximately 100 feet away. The distance between them tells its own story, or the beginning of one, anyway. Something had happened in that space between them. Movement. Separation. The dog may have tried to protect her. The sequence of events in those critical minutes, who was attacked first, how the violence unfolded, what Katie experienced in the moments before the end, none of that has been publicly established. But the defensive wounds on her hands say that she was present. That she was conscious. That she knew. Emma Clark sat somewhere outside the park and waited for the police, and the world kept being the world, warm, dark, the city humming its indifferent nighttime hum, and nothing about it had changed except that the woman she had built 7 years of her life with was lying near a tree inside a gate she had probably walked through 1,000 times before. In the days that followed, the investigation began. The Atlanta Police Department's homicide unit took the case. Detectives walked the scene. Evidence was collected. The medical examiner performed the autopsy. The FBI joined within days, the involvement of federal investigators signaling both the seriousness of the case and the limits of what local law enforcement could do alone. They searched for the murder weapon. Divers searched a pond inside the park. Nothing was found. They pulled footage from every camera in the area, businesses, residences, anything with a lens pointed toward the streets that Katie had walked that night. A security camera near 10th and Piedmont had captured her at the Rainbow Crosswalk around 1 a.m., moving in the direction of the park. That was the last image. After that, the trail went dark. Because inside the park, the cameras were dead. The city would later confirm what people had already begun to suspect, that the cameras in Piedmont Park were old and non-functional. They were mounted on their poles and pointed at their angles, and they looked, from a distance, exactly like what they were supposed to be. But they recorded nothing. For years, the appearance of surveillance had substituted for actual surveillance, and on the night that it mattered most, the difference was absolute. It would take 9 months after Katie's murder for new, functional cameras to be installed in Piedmont Park. 9 months. In the meantime, a community tried to understand what had happened in a park that had always felt like theirs. People stopped walking at night. People who had walked those paths for years looked at them differently now, looked at the trees, the shadows, the places where the light didn't reach. The familiar places began to feel like they contained something that had always been there and that no one had ever seen clearly enough to name. Friends gathered at Campagnolo, the restaurant where Katie had worked. They sat at the bar and they talked about her, the warmth of her, the intelligence, the way she could make a stranger feel like a regular just by the quality of her attention. They did not want to go on camera. They did not want to perform their grief. They simply wanted to sit in the place where she had been and remember. Chip Powell, her co-worker of 8 years, spoke. He said she was the most down-to-earth, beautiful spirit you would ever meet. He said so many people in the community knew and loved her. The past tense hung in the air the way past tense always does when it has arrived too early. Emma Clark sent a text message to a reporter rather than give an interview. She said she was just trying to get through the day. She said she had planned to spend the rest of her life with Katie, someone who was always teaching her new things and was the best dog mom. She said, about those final terrible moments, the part that broke her, not knowing if in those final moments she was protecting him or him her. At the vigil held in the park the following week, Emma's father Joe Clark stood and spoke. He did not speak the way people speak when they are managing their emotions. He spoke the way people speak when the emotions are managing them. He said they were left to die alone. He said the way Katie died, no one should ever have to. And then he said, there is a monster on the loose in the city of Atlanta. He wasn't wrong. And 3 years later, and then 4, the monster still had no name. The city of Atlanta, in the days after Katherine Janness was killed, began to remember what it already knew but had managed to forget, that the familiar is not the same as the safe. There is a particular kind of cognitive adjustment that cities make around violence. It happens quickly and almost unconsciously. People who walk the same route every night begin to vary their routes. People who walked alone begin to find someone to walk with. People who never thought about what time it was when they stepped out the door begin to think about it very carefully. The city doesn't stop moving. But it moves differently. It moves with its eyes open in a way it hadn't before. The neighborhood around Piedmont Park, Midtown Atlanta, a place full of restaurants and bars and art galleries and rainbow crosswalks and a quality of life that people worked hard to afford, was shaken in the specific way that communities are shaken when the violence does not fit their mental map of where violence happens. This was their park. Their streets. A woman who worked at restaurants they probably ate at, who walked a dog they would have petted if they'd passed her on the sidewalk, who collected books and wrote songs and taught herself guitar. She was not an abstraction. She was them. And whoever had done this to her was, by extension, close to them in a way that the geography of the crime made impossible to dismiss. Walk with someone else right now, a friend of Katie's named Christy Jo Stupa told the media. Walk in a group and don't walk at night. This community is not safe. That warning, practical, specific, arising from genuine terror, is also one of those things that ages badly. Because in a country where the advice given to women who want to be safe is so often a long list of adjustments and accommodations and precautions, there is something exhausting about it. As if safety were a thing to be managed through vigilance rather than something everyone deserves without having to plan for it. But Christy Jo Stupa was not making a political statement. She was afraid. And her fear was rational. Emma Clark was living inside a grief that was not permitted to be purely grief. In the weeks after Katie's death, the internet began to do what the internet does. It organized itself into theories and accusations and the peculiar certainty of people who have access to nothing except what the news has reported. Emma had made a GoFundMe. She had been the one to find the body. She had given interviews in the immediate aftermath of the murder. And people watched those interviews the way people watch for things to condemn, for expressions that land wrong, for reactions that don't match the script they have decided a grieving person should follow. They decided Emma was suspicious. They posted her address online. They left voicemails. One caller called her choice words and told her she would be caught. She sent that recording to the police. She bought a gun. I don't think I'll ever make any sense of any of it, she told Fox 5 Atlanta, because Katie wasn't the kind of person who had a problem with anybody. She wasn't talking about suspects. She was talking about the impossibility of the thing, about the fact that there was no logic she could find that ended in this outcome. No sequence of events or personality traits or choices that explained why Katie Janness, specifically, was dead. Emma's father, Joe Clark, who had held Katie as a daughter, who had watched the two women build a life together over 7 years, made public statements on his daughter's behalf. He detailed how Emma's address had been shared online. He described the flood of accusations and threats and the bizarre, vicious certainty of strangers who had appointed themselves investigators. Emma is the new victim, he said. And in a very real sense, she was. For months after the murder, Emma Clark gave an interview to CBS 46 in which she asked the Atlanta Police Department publicly to clear her name. She described her cooperation with investigators. She described their treatment of her, that they hadn't approached her with hostility, had asked their questions and received her answers, had never treated her, as far as she could perceive, like someone they considered responsible. She said, "They asked me questions, never treated me like they thought I had anything to do with it." But the APD declined to issue a public statement clearing her. Their response was careful and procedural, the investigation was active and ongoing, and releasing information publicly risked compromising it. This is standard language. It is also deeply inadequate for a person receiving death threats while grieving the murder of her partner. What Emma had wanted, what was perhaps the only thing that could have drawn a line between her and the avalanche of public suspicion, was a simple sentence from the people who actually had access to the evidence. A sentence that would have cost nothing except the willingness to say it. It was not said. She eventually moved out of the apartment she had shared with Katie. She used the majority of the GoFundMe donations, roughly $79,000 had been raised in a campaign titled, "Katie Gone Too Soon," to purchase a new condominium. The rest went toward the funeral and a charitable donation. This too became fodder for the people watching from the outside, the people who had decided what Emma was before they knew anything real about her. It is worth pausing here to say something plainly. No evidence has ever been presented connecting Emma Clark to the death of Katherine Janness. The police have never publicly named her as a suspect. The investigation, conducted over years with the resources of the Atlanta Police Department, the Fulton County District Attorney's Office, the Fulton County Sheriff's Office, and the FBI, has not resulted in any arrest, and no suspect of any kind has been publicly identified. But the internet rarely requires evidence. It requires narrative. And Emma, standing at the most visible intersection of the tragedy, the person who found the bodies, the person who made the 911 call, the person whose name appeared on the GoFundMe, the person whose grief was visible on a screen, was a narrative that organized itself very easily in the minds of people who were not there and did not know. Meanwhile, the investigation continued in the slow, unglamorous way that real investigations do, not in the televised montage of breakthroughs and revelations, but in the daily accumulation of interviews and lab results and leads that went nowhere and phone data that raised more questions than it answered. The surveillance image from the Rainbow Crosswalk was released. Investigators appealed to the public for information. If you heard or saw anything, even if you weren't in the park, please come forward. The FBI was working with APD on a weekly basis, meeting to discuss the case, reviewing the forensic data that had been collected. The investigation had shifted toward what Deputy Chief Charles Hampton described in a March 2022 press conference as a forensic investigation. "We are relying on the science and the technology," he said. Which is another way of saying they had something. Something from the scene, DNA, perhaps, recovered from the crime scene, from Katie's clothing or body or from Bowie's wounds. Something that required laboratory analysis rather than witness testimony. Something that required patience. The murder weapon was never recovered. Divers searched the pond and the park in the days after the crime. Nothing surfaced. What remained, in the space where answers should have been, was the carved word on Katie's chest. 3 letters. A word that had been placed on her body by someone who took the time, in the dark, after a sustained and violent attack, in a city park near a major thoroughfare, to do that additional thing. To make a mark. To leave a word. That word is either the clearest possible statement of motive or the most deliberate red herring. It speaks either to someone who knew Katie, who had a specific and personal fury toward her, or to someone whose violence carries its own language, a private grammar of hatred that they apply regardless of who the target is. The detectives working the case have never said publicly which interpretation they favor. And in the absence of their answer, the question sits in the open like an unhealed wound. A bench was eventually installed at the dog park inside Piedmont Park, the place where Katie and Bowie had spent their free time, the place they returned to week after week with the comfortable rhythm of creatures who love a place and are loved by it. It sits there now. A physical reminder in polished wood and metal that a life happened here. That a person existed and was loved and walked this ground and is gone. The bench has no answers either. But it has presence. And presence, when it is all that remains, is not nothing. There is a question that lives at the center of this story that no amount of investigation has answered, and it is not the question everyone assumes it is. It is not who did this. It is not yet. That question matters enormously, but it is the question that requires a name, a face, a piece of evidence that can be held in the light and examined. The question at the center of this story, the one that matters in a different way, in a quieter and more disturbing way, is this: how does this happen and nobody sees it? Piedmont Park is not a remote location. It is not a wilderness area or a dark back road or an isolated place that people are surprised to hear mentioned in connection with violence. It is 185 acres in the heart of Midtown Atlanta, surrounded on all sides by one of the city's most densely populated and actively used neighborhoods. Henry's Midtown Tavern, where Emma was working that night, is on 10th Street, the same street that runs along the edge of the park. The Rainbow Crosswalk where Katie was last photographed alive is at 10th and Piedmont, a literal intersection in a busy part of the city. At 1 a.m. on a summer night in Atlanta, there are people around. Not as many as at 9 p.m. or midnight, but not none. This is a city. Cities don't sleep completely. And yet, no witnesses have come forward. No one has reported seeing anything that placed another person near Katie and Bowie at the critical moment. The cameras that might have recorded the interior of the park were non-functional. The murder weapon has never been found. The person who did this walked into Piedmont Park sometime during the late night hours of July 27 or the early morning hours of July 28, 2021, and committed an act of extraordinary violence, and walked out again, and has never been identified. In the language of law enforcement, this is a case in which the forensic evidence is the primary, perhaps the only, remaining path to resolution. The DNA. The biology. The tiny invisible traces that a violent encounter leaves on surfaces and bodies and in the air, and that survive long after the person who left them believes they are gone. Deputy Chief Hampton spoke in measured, careful language about the forensic approach. Investigations take time. We've been fortunate to get some of these high-profile cases solved in days and weeks. And then there are other cases that our team continues to work diligently. The subtext of that statement is its own quiet horror, that the solving of a case sometimes depends on circumstances that have nothing to do with the dedication of the investigators. That sometimes you do everything right and the answer still doesn't come. On the 2-year anniversary of Katie's death, the Atlanta Police Department held a press conference. Lead investigator Lieutenant Jeffrey Churchill pushed back on a reporter who had called the case cold. "We don't consider this a cold case," he said. "We're still working on leads coming in, so we don't consider it cold." He added, "We want to get it right. The distinction matters to him. And perhaps to the evidence, wherever it is. But for the people who loved Katie Janness, the distinction between cold and merely unsolved is academic at best and agonizing at worst." The year 1 anniversary came. Then year 2. Then 3. Then 4. The bench in the dog park accumulated seasons. The new cameras in Piedmont Park, all 31 of them, integrated into the city's video integrated center, pointed their functional eyes at paths that were no longer going to help find the person who had already walked away. Emma Clark's father-in-law, Joe Clark, spoke in the 4th year of waiting with the kind of controlled fury that only comes from years of hope that has been refused its resolution. His daughter had moved. Her address had been posted online. She had received death threats. She had bought a gun. She had done all of this while also being the person who found the bodies of the 2 beings she had shared her daily life with, the woman who had been her partner for 7 years and the dog whose name she had chosen and whose leash had been in Katie's hand when everything ended. Katie was a beautiful, talented soul that had so much to give to the world, the Clark family statement read on the 3rd anniversary, and always was a champion of those less fortunate. "We are still in hope of justice being served to the person or persons responsible and pray that the Atlanta Police Department and the FBI find this monster before they repeat the heinous acts done to our sweet Katie and her precious dog Bowie." The phrase "before they repeat" stays in the mind. Because implicit in that hope is a fear that whoever did this is still walking among them. Still in Atlanta. Still perhaps in Midtown. Still, perhaps, walking paths that they have walked before. That the park with its new cameras and its increased patrols and its bench inscribed with a name might still contain, on certain late nights, something dangerous that hasn't yet been found. That fear is not irrational. It is simply the reality of an unsolved murder of this nature, committed in a public place, with no identified perpetrator, with evidence that has not yet yielded an arrest. The case is, in the most literal sense, open. Open in the legal sense and open in every other sense too. A wound that the city has been living around for years without being able to close it. The community responded in the ways communities respond. Vigils were held. Flowers and dog treats were placed at the park entrance. The GoFundMe raised $79,000 in days, a number that speaks to the love people had for a woman many of them knew and the terror that the manner of her death placed in people who understood that they could have been walking that same path. The Atlanta City Council voted in August 2021 to install security cameras in the park, a vote that came 1 month after a murder that might have been recorded if the cameras had been working, and it took 9 more months for those cameras to actually be installed and operational. The Department of Parks and Recreation would eventually invest $600,000 in cameras alone. In 2026, 5 years after the murder, additional cameras were still being added to the park's inventory. The park now has eyes. 54 eyes, and more coming. They arrived too late for Katie. She had grown up in Michigan. Her mother and her sister still lived there, in Beverly Hills, Michigan, in the suburb outside Detroit where she had come from. Her mother wrote a letter in August 2021 that was published by WSB-TV, and the details of that letter belong to a private grief that deserves its privacy. What we know from it is what we know from any parent's grief over a child lost to violence, that the particular form of that grief doesn't really have a language, and the attempts to give it one always fall short. Katie had made Atlanta her city. Had made it her home in the fullest sense, the friends here, the restaurants, the park, the apartment with its shelves of books and the sound of a guitar being worked out note by note in a spare bedroom or a kitchen. She had arrived at 40 with a life that was, by every available account, exactly what she had wanted it to be. And then she walked out the door with a dog on a leash. There is a version of this story in which that walk ends the way 1,000 other walks had ended, with Bowie circling a lamppost and Katie pulling gently at the leash in the warm Atlanta night, releasing them both back to the apartment and the bed and the ordinary continuation of tomorrow. There is a version in which she comes home, and Emma gets home later from Henry's, and in the morning the apartment is full of dog hair and coffee and the sound of 2 people moving around each other in the comfortable unconscious choreography of people who share a life. That version existed, for a while, as a possibility. And then, somewhere in the dark near the gate at 10th Street and Charles Allen Drive, it stopped existing. What happened in those minutes, the exact sequence of events, the precise moment when the ordinary became catastrophic, the question of whether she heard something before she saw it or whether the attack came with such speed that there was no interval of knowing, none of that is publicly established. The defensive wounds on her hands indicate she was conscious and fighting. The distance between her body and Bowie suggests movement and chaos in those final moments, an unraveling of safety that happened quickly and completely. But the details are held in the evidence. And the evidence is in a lab somewhere. And the lab is doing what labs do, patient, precise, working in a language of molecules and markers that doesn't care about anniversaries or press conferences or the particular grief of people waiting for an answer that hasn't come yet. The investigators say they are still working. That they have leads. That they are waiting for the science. And the park bench sits in the dog park. And it waits too. To understand what happened to Katherine Janness, or to try, which is all anyone can do, you have to think about the geography of a summer night in a way that most people never have to think about it. Walk it in your mind. Start from the apartment. A mile from the park, give or take. A Midtown mile, meaning sidewalks lit by restaurants and streetlights and the ambient glow of a dense, lively neighborhood. Emma's dog Bowie pulling at the leash, excited in the way young dogs are excited by nighttime, by the smells that rise differently in warm air, by the whole world opening up around his nose. Katie keeping pace, comfortable, knowing these streets the way she knew her own hands. She stopped at Henry's. That much is documented. She said hi to Emma, who was working. The time was approximately 11:35 in the evening. She did not stay long. She and Bowie walked on. The next image of her, the only other one, is from a security camera near 10th Street and Piedmont Avenue. The time was approximately 1 in the morning. She was crossing the Rainbow Crosswalk. Moving not toward home, but in the other direction. That is an interval of roughly 90 minutes between documented sightings. 90 minutes of a walk through a neighborhood she knew completely, on a summer night, with a dog. 90 minutes that hold within them everything that happened, every step, every turn, every moment before the last one, and reveal nothing. Why was she walking away from home at 1 in the morning? This question has been examined from many angles and answered from none. The most charitable interpretation is the simplest one: she was extending the walk. Bowie had energy. The night was warm and she was in no rush. She had no particular reason to be anywhere. Emma was at work. The apartment was empty. The city was alive and familiar. A longer walk was not, in itself, suspicious or reckless or wrong. It was ordinary. But the direction, away from home, toward the park entrance at that hour, is a detail that has no witness attached to it, no companion to explain it, no voice to say yes, she said she was going to do this, I know why, it makes sense. It exists as an isolated fact in a case full of isolated facts, each one sitting slightly apart from the others, refusing to connect into a picture that resolves. The park entrance at 10th Street and Charles Allen Drive is not isolated. It is a gate in a fence along the park's perimeter. During the day, that entrance is busy, dog walkers and joggers and people cutting through. At 1 a.m. on a Wednesday in late July, it is quieter. Not empty. But quieter. Quieter in the way that makes the sound of footsteps meaningful. Quieter in the way that makes the distance between you and the nearest other person feel larger than it is. Whatever happened, happened near that gate. Bowie was found approximately 100 feet away. Katie was found close to a tree inside the entrance. The distance between them, and the defensive wounds on her hands, tell the beginning of a story that the evidence, carefully controlled, released sparingly, has not yet told fully in public. There is the question of the word carved into her chest. Fat. 3 letters. Cut, not drawn. Requiring proximity, requiring time, requiring a deliberateness that exists in a different register entirely from the frenzy of 50-plus stab wounds. The stab wounds speak to rage that has lost its shape. The carved letters speak to something that retained its shape even in the midst of that rage, something that knew what it wanted to say and said it. Criminal psychologists who have commented on cases of this nature, though none have been officially named in connection with this investigation, tend to divide violent crimes into 2 broad categories: expressive and instrumental. Expressive violence is driven by emotion, rage, hatred, humiliation, and often exceeds what would have been necessary to achieve any practical goal. Instrumental violence is purposeful, controlled, aimed at an outcome beyond the act itself. What happened to Katherine Janness appears, at first glance, to be expressive. The volume of wounds. The face, the throat. The sheer excess of what was done. But the letters complicate that reading. You do not pause to carve letters in an act of pure frenzy. You pause because you want to. The theories that have circulated around this case reflect the difficulty of holding both of those things simultaneously. They fracture into different directions, and each direction takes different facts with it. Theory 1, someone Katie knew. Someone who had a personal reason, real or imagined, to hate her. Someone who knew her face well enough to direct their rage at it. The overkill speaks to intimacy. The word speaks to a grievance specific enough to be expressed in language. If this theory is correct, the killer is, or was, somewhere in the circumference of Katie's life. In her social world, her work world, the shared geography of Midtown Atlanta. Someone who knew her name and her face and her routes. But no one in that world has been publicly identified as a suspect. The investigation, as far as the public knows, has not produced a person of interest from that direction. Theory 2, a stranger. Someone who was in the park at that hour, or who targeted the park as a hunting ground, and who encountered Katie and Bowie in a moment of terrible opportunity. The late hour supports this. The public location supports this. The lack of witnesses and the apparent absence of a clear personal connection between victim and perpetrator keeps this theory alive. But the violence was not random in its character. It was personal in its character. The face. The specific word on her chest. Strangers who commit opportunistic violence in public parks do not typically pause to carve words. They strike and they run. Unless the word means something to the killer that doesn't require knowing the victim. Unless it is part of a private grammar of violence that gets applied to whoever is there. Unless it is not a message for Katie, specifically, but a message to someone, or to no one, that happens to have been written on her body. Theory 3, a hate crime. Katie was openly gay. She was part of a community that has historically been the target of violence for exactly that reason. The mutilation, the carving, the focus on the face, the specificity of the degradation, could speak to a hatred not of Katie personally but of what she represented to someone whose hatred of gay women had been building toward an expression. Investigators have never confirmed this as the motive. They have not ruled it out either. All three theories are incomplete. All three explain some of the facts and fail to account for others. None of them, followed to their logical conclusion, arrives at a person who can be named and confronted and held accountable. The case file sits in the Atlanta Police Homicide Unit. The DNA evidence, recovered from the scene, from Bowie, from Katie's body, sits in a laboratory. The FBI meets with APD investigators. The weekly meetings continue. And outside, in the park, on a bench in the dog park where Katie and Bowie used to go on ordinary afternoons with ordinary joy, the seasons change. The Atlanta summers come and the humidity rises and dogs pull their owners across the grass and it is loud and alive and full of the unconcerned happiness of dogs who do not know about the past. The bench remains. Her name remains. The question remains. It is worth returning to the ordinary details of Katherine Janness' life, not because they explain what happened but because they are the only complete picture we have, and they deserve their fullness. She taught herself to play guitar. That is not a small thing. That is the kind of ambition that doesn't announce itself, that sits in a room alone with an instrument and the frustration of calloused fingertips and wrong notes until, through patience and something like love, the notes become music. She wrote songs. Co-workers described her as an artist. Her future father-in-law described her as someone who was always teaching Emma new things. A person with the guitar in her hands in a quiet room, working something out, that is a specific image, and it holds something about who she was that no crime report can capture. She collected books. Not just owned them, collected them. There is a difference. Owning books is convenience. Collecting them is a relationship. It implies return visits to favorite shelves, the particular pleasure of a cover that has been opened so many times the spine softens. It implies a life lived in conversation with language, with stories, with the accumulated intelligence of people who sat in quiet rooms and worked something out and decided to leave it behind. She was 40. And 40, for someone like Katie, is not the beginning of an ending but the middle of a building. A point from which the future stretches out in multiple directions, all of them chosen, all of them hers. The book still unread. The songs still unwritten. The walks not yet taken with the dog she would have had for another decade, with the woman she had been building a life with for 7 years and intended to build with for the rest of it. Emma had described her as the most intelligent, kind, humble, and beautiful person she had ever known. She had wanted to spend every second with her. 7 years. 7 years of mornings and arguments and groceries and the accumulated intimacy of two people learning each other. 7 years of being known. 7 years of being someone's person in the particular sense that Joe Clark meant when he said it, not just a partner or a companion but the specific irreplaceable person whose absence makes a hole in the world that no one else can fill. Emma Clark has lived with that hole for years now. She moved out of the apartment they had shared. She moved into a new place, purchased partly with the money people sent because they wanted to do something, because the helplessness of grief needs something to do with itself. She moved, and presumably tried to build something new around the shape of what was gone. Whether she has succeeded in that, whether anyone can succeed in that, is a private question that belongs to her. What the public has been left with is the architecture of a case that remains open. The facts that are known. The facts that may never be known. The slow official language of ongoing investigations and active leads and the science being relied upon. And the silence that sits in the middle of all of it. There is a particular kind of silence in an unsolved murder case. It is not the silence of ignorance. The detectives working this case know things that the public does not know, hold evidence that the public cannot see, follow threads and directions that the press conferences deliberately leave vague to protect the investigation. It is the silence of incompletion. Of a narrative that has its beginning and its end but whose middle, the essential who and why, the connective tissue between Katie crossing the rainbow crosswalk and the police arriving at 1:10 a.m., remains absent. In August 2024, the Atlanta Police Department again publicly asked for tips. They released new information requesting the public's help. They noted that the suspect remains unknown. They noted that their investigators have worked countless hours diligently and thoroughly. They asked, "Nothing is too small. If you heard or saw anything, even if you weren't in the park, please come forward." This is a specific kind of appeal. Even if you weren't in the park. Meaning, someone saw something that night who doesn't yet know they saw it. Someone passed a person on a street near Piedmont Park in the early morning hours of July 28, 2021. Someone heard something. Someone's memory holds a detail that they haven't recognized as relevant, a face, a car, someone moving with an unusual urgency through the Midtown streets after 1 a.m. That detail is somewhere. It exists in someone's memory, possibly filed under ordinary, possibly buried under the more vivid events of the days that followed, possibly dismissed because at the time it registered as nothing. The people who carry that detail don't know they're carrying it. That is perhaps the most unsettling part of the whole case. Not that someone in Atlanta knows who did this and is protecting them, though that is possible. But that someone in Atlanta might have the answer and doesn't know they have it. That justice might be sitting in an unexamined corner of someone's mind, waiting to be recognized. Atlanta Police Homicide Detective Jeffrey Churchill said in 2023, "We want to get it right." The word right lands with weight when you consider what right requires here, not just an arrest, not just a body to prosecute, but the correct body. The correct person. Evidence sufficient to survive a trial, sufficient to leave no reasonable doubt that this is the person who carried a weapon into Piedmont Park and used it on a 40-year-old woman who was walking her dog. Getting it right, in a case without witnesses and without a recovered weapon, takes time. Getting it right, in a case where the forensic evidence is the primary path forward, depends on science that moves in its own timeframe, regardless of anniversaries or press conferences or the grief of the people waiting. And the grieving people wait. Katie's mother in Beverly Hills, Michigan. Her sister. Emma Clark in her new home somewhere in Atlanta. Joe Clark, who called himself a father-in-law because that is what he was, regardless of paperwork. Chip Powell and the colleagues at the Improv Theater and the regulars at Campagnolo who remembered the quality of her attention, the warmth of her presence behind a bar. They have been waiting for 4 years. The bench in the dog park has no clock. It doesn't measure the waiting. It only holds the name. There is a thing that happens to a city when it holds an unsolved murder for long enough. Not the dramatic thing, not panic, not vigilante anger, not civic collapse. Something quieter and more corrosive. The story fades from the front page. The press conferences become annual rather than monthly. The initial urgency of the investigation becomes, gradually, background noise, still present, still active if you look for it, but no longer the daily headline. The park fills up again. People begin to walk at night again. The caution that descended in the summer of 2021 loosens its grip, the way caution always does when the acute terror of a specific event gives way to the diffuse reality of continuing to live in a place. People cannot remain vigilant indefinitely. The mind, efficient as it is, files danger under past when enough time passes without another incident. And Southwest Piedmont Park becomes again what it was, full of dog walkers and joggers and couples and families and the whole gorgeous, indifferent business of public life in a city. The rainbow crosswalk gets its colors refreshed. The new cameras blink their patient red lights. The bench in the dog park sits in its corner. And somewhere, in a neighborhood, in a house, in a life being lived somewhere in or around Atlanta, is the person who killed Katherine Janness. This is not speculation. This is simply the logic of an unsolved crime. Someone did this. That person exists. They have been existing for 4 years in the same time frame as the investigation, in the same city, perhaps passing the same streets. They may have watched the news coverage. They may have read the press conference transcripts. They may have sat through the anniversaries and the renewed appeals for tips and the increasingly forensic language of the investigators without flinching, without confessing, without making the kind of mistake that would have brought the investigation to its resolution. Or they may not be in Atlanta anymore. May have moved. Maybe living somewhere that the name Katherine Janness means nothing, where Piedmont Park is an abstraction, where the summer of 2021 is just the summer before the pandemic ended and the world tried to remember how to reopen. A life being lived in a place where the weight of what was done simply doesn't arrive. Either is possible. Neither helps. The DNA evidence that investigators have placed such emphasis on exists because DNA doesn't lie, doesn't move, doesn't change its story under pressure. It is patient in a way that human beings cannot be. It sits in its sample container in whatever state it was collected in and waits for a match. It waits for the database hit, for the familial connection that places a relative at a scene even when the person themselves hasn't been tested, for the investigative genealogy techniques that have been used successfully in other long cold cases, the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo, the years-long cases that were broken not by traditional investigation but by the accumulated genetic information of millions of ordinary people who sent cheek swabs to ancestry websites. Those techniques exist. Law enforcement uses them. APD has indicated they are using every available scientific and technological resource. Whether that includes investigative genetic genealogy has not been confirmed, but the forensic direction of the investigation is consistent with a case in which the DNA has been collected and preserved and has simply not yet matched to any profile in the available databases. The match may come tomorrow. It may come in a year. It may come, as it did in other cases, a decade after the crime, when someone who shares half their genome with the unknown subject submits a saliva swab to learn about their family history and unknowingly opens a door that investigators have been pushing on for years. That door is out there. Somewhere. And someone may be about to open it without knowing what's behind it. These are the shapes that justice takes when it refuses to be quick. It takes patience. It takes the cooperation of strangers who don't know they're cooperating. It takes the DNA sitting in its container, steady and accurate and unbothered by the passage of time. Emma Clark, who has lived through everything that followed the loss of the woman she was going to spend her life with, said something in an early interview that has stayed in the public record of this case like a note played in a minor key. She wonders, she said, if convenience or mere chance was the reason Katie was targeted. Convenience. Or mere chance. Two words that carry between them the entire weight of the randomness theory, the idea that there was no reason, no logic, no personal history that led to this outcome. Just the presence of a woman in a park at the wrong moment. Just a collision between a life and whatever moved through that park that night. If that is true, if it was chance, then it is in some ways the most unbearable possibility. Because chance offers nothing to work with. It has no face to find. No grudge to trace. No logic that would allow you to look back and identify the error that could be corrected. If it was chance, then Katie was simply there. And anyone could have been there. And the only thing that made it her was the fact that it was. Emma said she wasn't worried when Katie went out for the walk. She said Katie knew all the streets. She knew everywhere she was going, all the time. This is the kind of certainty that life builds over years of safe returns, over the accumulated evidence of a partner who comes home, who is known in the neighborhood, who walks with the ease of someone fluent in the language of the city around her. That certainty was not wrong. It was not naive. It was the reasonable conclusion of all available evidence, 7 years of evidence, 1,000 evenings, 100 late-night dog walks through a city that had always given her back. The confidence that Emma had in Katie's safety was earned. It was real. It was also, in the particular way that this story is built, the exact confidence that made the absence so catastrophic. Because when you are certain someone will come home, you don't mobilize at the first silence. You extend the benefit of the doubt. You wait a little longer. You check the phone app when the calls go unanswered, and then you get on your bike, and then you ride toward the park, and somewhere in that interval, between the apartment door and the park gate, the world you thought you were living in ceases to exist. Emma did everything right. She checked. She went looking. She found her. She has had to live with what that means for 4 years. There is a particular quality to what remains when something unspeakable happens and the world continues. The world continued. That is the undeniable, almost obscene fact at the center of every story like this one. The city of Atlanta woke up on the morning of July 28, 2021 and continued its business. The restaurants opened. The bars filled. People crossed the rainbow crosswalk on 10th Street and took photographs and kept walking. Piedmont Park opened its gates and the dog walkers came in with their dogs and the joggers came with their headphones and the children came with their parents. The park absorbed the crime the way parks absorb everything, slowly, quietly, without changing its fundamental character. Life continued. And Katherine Janness was gone from it. There is a letter that her mother wrote in August of 2021, a few weeks after the murder, that was published in Atlanta. The details of it belong to her mother. What is worth saying is simply that it existed, that there is a woman in Beverly Hills, Michigan who had a daughter, who raised that daughter in the Detroit area, who watched her grow into the person that Chip Powell described as the most down-to-earth, beautiful spirit you would ever meet. That the distance between Michigan and Atlanta, which was manageable when the person at the other end of it was alive and calling and visiting, became a different kind of distance after July 28. A permanent distance. The kind that has no closing. Katie's sister is there too. In Michigan. With her mother. Two people who carry a private grief at whatever remove from the public grief that has been visible for 4 years, the press conferences and the vigils and the anniversary statements and the bench in the dog park and the annual appeals for tips. Joe Clark, who would have been her father-in-law, has spoken in a kind of sustained controlled grief that has not diminished over 4 years. He has said things in public that you say when you have been given no choice but to continue living with a question that refuses to be answered. He has spoken about Emma, about her grief, about the harassment she suffered, about the death threats, about the way a person can survive the worst thing that happens to them and then be asked to survive the public's response to it as well. He has spoken about the monster. About needing the monster to be found before they do it again. That phrase, before they do it again, sits at the bottom of this story like a weight. Because it implies not only that justice has not been served but that the absence of justice carries a forward-looking risk. That whatever motivated this crime, personal hatred or predatory violence or something that exists only inside the mind of the person who committed it, remains. Has not been identified. Has not been contained. Has not been made unable to do it again. Whether that risk is real or abstract is a question that nobody can answer without knowing who did this and why. And nobody knows that yet. What the investigation has produced, to the extent it is publicly known, is a direction. A forensic direction. DNA. Biology. The science that APD has said repeatedly they are relying on. The weekly meetings with the FBI. The leads that are being worked. The evidence that is being processed with patience and precision by people who are doing their jobs and still believe, that the science will deliver what the witnesses couldn't. In an era when cold cases from the 1980s are being solved through genetic genealogy, when a cheek swab sent to a consumer ancestry website by someone who just wanted to know where their grandparents came from can break open a case that has been open for 40 years, the idea that a case from 2021 with preserved DNA evidence might eventually be resolved is not wishful thinking. It is a reasonable hope. A methodologically grounded hope. The kind of hope that has been vindicated repeatedly in cases that seemed, at their most frustrating moment, completely impenetrable. The technology exists. The evidence was collected. The investigators are still working. The databases grow every year as more people submit their DNA for every kind of reason except the one that will eventually matter, every birthday present genealogy kit, every health screening, every casual decision to learn something about your genetic heritage, adds one more potential connection to a database that has already helped solve cases exactly like this one. The answer may already be in that database, waiting for the match. There are things about this case that we may never know regardless of whether an arrest is made. We may never know the full sequence of events inside that park, what happened in the dark, in the interval between the rainbow crosswalk and the park gate, in the minutes before the 911 call. We may never know why the walk extended in that direction at that hour. We may never know what Bowie experienced, or what role, in those terrible final moments, the young dog played in the story of what happened to the woman he went out walking with. We may never know what the carved word meant to the person who carved it. We may know who. We may never know why in the way that would actually satisfy the question, the deep why, the psychological interior of an act that defies ordinary comprehension, the architecture of a mind that did this thing and then walked back out into the warm Atlanta night and continued to exist. Some things that are solved remain, at their center, inexplicable. But the who? The who matters in a different register. The who means accountability. The who means that the case file closes, that the anniversary press conferences end, that Emma Clark is no longer living in a world where the person who killed her partner has never faced a consequence. The who means that Joe Clark's anger and fear, the fear of it happening again, has at least the partial resolution of a name and a face and a trial. The who is what the investigators are working toward. Patiently. In laboratories and meeting rooms and database searches and the slow accumulation of forensic certainty. They haven't found it yet. But they are looking. There is a bench in a dog park inside Piedmont Park, Atlanta. Katie and Bowie used to go there. On ordinary afternoons, on the days off, on the days when the Atlanta sun was doing what the Atlanta sun does and the park was full of other dogs and other people and the whole alive ordinary beautiful business of being in a city that had become, over years, a home. The bench sits there now. With her name. Dogs walk past it with their owners every day. Some of them stop and sniff at its base with the focused intensity of dogs doing dog things, checking the bulletin board of 1,000 noses that have passed this way before. Their owners don't always read the name. Some do. Some pause. Some remember. New people who never knew her walk past without stopping at all. The bench doesn't require recognition to hold its meaning. It holds it regardless. And somewhere in Atlanta, or somewhere not in Atlanta, a person is living a life that includes what they did in Piedmont Park on the night of July 27th into the early morning hours of July 28, 2021. Whether they think about it every day or have buried it under the ordinary sediment of years, the DNA they left behind is still there. Still patient. Still waiting. The science doesn't forget. And the question, the one that has lived at the center of this case for 4 years, is not really who killed Katherine Janness, though that is the question that has a name for an answer. The question underneath that one, the one that will outlast even the solving of the case, is the one that has no satisfying answer in any direction. How does someone you love walk out the door one evening, in a city you both know, in a neighborhood that has always been safe enough, and simply not come back? How do you learn to live in a world that contained that possibility and gave you no warning? That is the question that Emma Clark has been living with for 4 years. That is the question that Katie's mother carries in Michigan, and her sister, and Joe Clark, and Chip Powell, and every person who stood at the park entrance and left flowers and dog treats in those first terrible days. It is a question without an answer. It has always been without an answer. The person who killed Katherine Janness cannot undo the absence they created. An arrest, a trial, a conviction, all of it matters, all of it constitutes something real and important and necessary, but none of it returns what was taken. None of it closes the particular hole that opened when a 40-year-old woman who collected books and taught herself guitar and loved a woman named Emma and walked a dog named Bowie stopped existing. The bench in the dog park is not a resolution. It is a refusal to forget. If you've stayed this far, if you've sat with this story until the end, then you know why cases like this one matter. Not just as crimes to be solved, but as lives to be witnessed. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share the name Katherine Janness if you know it, if you've heard of this case, if you are somewhere near Atlanta and remember the summer it happened. Subscribe if you want to keep sitting with stories that deserve more than a headline. And if you know anything at all, about what happened in Piedmont Park on the night of July 28, 2021, the Atlanta Police Department's homicide unit is still answering calls. Some questions are still open. Katherine Janness. 40 years old. A bartender. A musician. A reader. A person who loved a dog and a woman and a city. Still waiting for her name to mean something more than this.